I talk for a second?
Excursion into
Coaching. Georgie Nightingall. Nightingale? Am I saying that correctly?
Nightingale, yes.
Nightingale.
I think near enough. Most people get it wrong, so you're doing a good job.
I'm so glad I'm like all the other people.
Yes, unique.
Yes, indeed. Georgie, it's so nice to have you here. Here we are talking about coaching. That's my catchphrase, and that's really what we're going to do here. We're going to be talking about coaching. We're going to probably be talking about a lot more than that, knowing how previous conversations went. You're doing a lot of things. At the same time, you have a pretty clear umbrella, which is something I'm quite excited about, because for you, it's all about conversations. And I think for coaches, it's all about conversations. So who better to talk to than somebody who's been diving into conversations, how we can start them, how we can have small talks, how we can talk to strangers, how to just generally have better conversations, is something that is fascinating to me. And I think that's why it's going to be so valuable to talk to each other about some of the stuff we already talked to about, and maybe taking a step deeper. But, generally we go into all kinds of directions. I reckon we have a lot of things in common, and that's why I'm excited to speak to you today. So welcome, Georgie, to the podcast. Perhaps by means of introduction, for people who don't know you like I do, I think it would be helpful to kind of give people a bit of an insight into where you're speaking from. Mm-hmm. And a question I kind of like about this, and this may add into your general area of interest, is like at a dinner party, when we still had those, when you meet like normal people, like non-coaching people, non-professional talkers, how do you introduce yourself? Somebody asks, what do you do for a living? Or what do you do? The kind of "who are you" question. What do you tell them in that kind of situation?
Yeah, so this is a good question, because part of my story is that I dislike being asked the question, "What do you do?" So not to diss your question or anything, but when people do ask, I sometimes answer them. But rather than share a title or a label and then leave it like that, I try and share a bit of a story. So when people ask me, what do I do? I tell them that I got bored with being asked the question, what do you do? And telling people my job, and then feeling stereotyped and bored by the repetitive conversation. And instead started trying to find a way to engineer more meaningful conversations. Conversations where you can get off script. You can find novel ideas, discoveries, actually feel like you're connected to a human being, and where there's a sense of adventure and play, and that's almost like without a goal in mind.
So can we make that real? Can you tell me that kind of story? I'm happy to role play with you and just ask you, hey, so what do you do?
So no, I probably would say something like that. I would say, I help people have more meaningful conversations and get away from small talk and having conversations that conversations that feel scripted, essentially. Mm-hmm. And I started that a number of years ago when I was very challenged by having always worked conversations, and I've been running an organization, Trigger Conversations, since then. So it's now 5 years. 5 years, wow. And since then, I've also been taking on lots of other different labels, including like coach, trainer, facilitator, speaker, I guess trying to continually explore my sense of who I can become, what value I can bring to the world, all under the umbrella of engineering a more meaningful world, a more meaningful and human world, in fact. Mm-hmm. I think when you were talking about conversations earlier, I was, as my umbrella, I've actually been trying to work out, do conversations fit under the umbrella of something else? And I think they do, because it's not just any kind of conversation, it's a conversation which gets to the heart of who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks so much for that. And that's definitely on my list to kind of explore that larger umbrella, because I'm aware you moved into this from conversations, but there's just so much more that conversations may lead to. But maybe let's stay with the previous umbrella for a little while, because that's one of my I went to an event, a trigger event, where you served a dinner, a course, a 3-course conversation meal, and I just loved that concept because I'm also a fan of having more meaningful conversations and perhaps break some of those scripts. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what those 3 conversation meals are and how they might be able to help coaches specifically have those kind of conversations.
Cool. There's 2 questions there. So I'll start with the first one, which is, what is this even about? So the evening which you described is the standard event that I came up with, which follows the metaphor of a dinner menu. So you go through courses of conversation. Each course represents different levels of depth. So like you start with canapes, sweet icebreakers. They're fast and furious. Then it goes to starters, which are like
fast and furious.
Fast and furious, yeah. I don't know how you like canapes, but and then starter is a little bit heavier, still quite light though, but some substance. And then the next one is the main course. You can have meat, deep and thoughtful conversation, or vegetarian, nourishing conversation, or fish, which is controversial conversation. Of course, everyone often goes for the fish. All these laughs at that point, and that's a richer course, and it's longer, and there's slightly more people. All the others are 1-to-1, and this is a group of 3. And then we have dessert, sweet and delightful conversation, and then our coffee, which is of course reflective, revitalizing, warming. And the idea of the event is you sort of start light, both in time and in depth. You go in heavier, meatier, and then you come out and you go light again. So it's playful. It encourages people to sort of step outside of the box, and also to do to follow a sequence that is just not normal, I guess. And I think one of the problems of conversations is that people feel like there's this standard way of doing things that they always have to follow. So if you say, hey, we're going to scrap the standard way because it's boring and frustrating, let's do something that's fun and different. I'm going to give you the questions. They're all going to be sort of randomly done. In fact, how you find a conversation partner is also random. And then you have a very set amount of time to have the conversation, and it's not enough time to censor. So people tend to just jump straight in, responding to these questions. And these are kinds of questions that invite people to share their story and their thoughts and feelings. Some of them can be hypothetical. Some of them are simply like, how does adventure fit into your life? Or like, what type of personality, if your personality was a, what is it called? I should get these questions right. Was a question mark or a exclamation mark, which one would it be? Anyway, and the invitation there is, to be authentic, basically. So that is the kind of the menu, per se. And your second question was about taking some of these, some of the learnings or some of the structure. Is that right? Applying it to coaches?
Yeah, I want to, I want to make this as practically applicable to coaches as possible. So one of the things that I've kind of, at some point, I looked at some of your stuff, I read your newsletter, I think, and I thought like, oh my God, this is like so relevant for coaches, especially when you think about marketing, getting new clients. The kind of Chandlerian school, Steve Chandler, Rich Litvin, the Prosperous Coach, all of these guys that talk about creating clients always happens through conversations. So when we find ourselves in conversations as coaches, it doesn't even have to be a prospect, or you might not even be thinking about a client, but you start building a relationship. And you start building a relationship with someone you don't yet know, where there's always the potential that this might lead up in a coaching relationship, or that they might learn something about what it's like to be in those kind of conversations, that you might refer them to a colleague of yours if that relationship is maybe a little too close for you. But the general idea is that you need to have as many conversations as possible as a coach in order to have a flourishing coaching business. And so creating conversation, especially with people we don't know, that's gold, So that's why I'm super interested in talking about that. How can you invite somebody into that kind of meal other than buying a ticket to your event and then say, hey, do you want to come with me? But like really, it's about where do you find those everyday people and how do you start that conversation? And I know there's a lot in there that you could respond to, but if we just keep it to the actual contemplates, for example, how do you offer that kind of question out to somebody? Could you give us some examples of questions you might ask, or some of those fast and furious questions you could throw out there?
Yeah, so one thing you kind of highlighted is the difference between this kind of event format and then something else which happens in real life. So when I first started to Trigger, it was the event formats that I was running, and people were aware that this is an unusual space, and therefore not exactly the same as what you would be doing if you were trying to have a conversation out on the street, for instance. I have actually developed training around the latter, which highlights the fact that people aren't really expecting to follow a particular sequence, and therefore people behave differently. The key part of all of this is that context matters. Context is absolutely critical within conversations for knowing where it is you can go, your propensity to, for instance, go deep. Because if you've got a buy-in from the beginning, i.e. people are self-selecting themselves to have a deep conversation, then they're much more likely to feel at ease and have the psychological safety to then be able to go deep. And we know this from coaching, right? You've set up the coaching relationship and probably set expectations at the front, and therefore people feel like when you ask them a really vulnerable question, they might actually say what the true thing is. When it comes to having conversations with people, the field is not necessarily empty, but there's a lot of blank space. You don't know what that person is like. You don't know how far you can go. And I actually think there's something very exciting about that, because you can push and you can explore and be very creative with that. So one of the things that one of the principles that comes through, I think, both in the events that I run and also the training, is to take risks, and be bold and ask questions that are a little bit unusual, a little bit off script, that show your curiosity through the questions and also curiosity through the answers. So, for instance, if you take some of the normal scripts we follow in everyday life, small talk, hi, how are you, the weather, where do you live, whatever it is. There's different ways of asking those questions. There's also different ways of answering. So if people ask you those kinds of questions, you absolutely do not have to answer in the expected way. So the expected way is usually, how are you? Fine. I use this as an opportunity to share something incredibly meaningful about how I'm feeling that day. Perhaps even inviting them into a story of what I'm up to right now. So if I'm being playful, sometimes I say, 8.5 out of 10. Or 9 out of 10, maybe more once I've had coffee, or maybe once I've read this book that I really want to read. So I'm getting people to be curious about my world. I'm also being a bit playful and showing them that I'm a bit of a human underneath.
So you wouldn't name that book that you're about to read. You would just kind of say something that invites an easy question about something that you're interested in.
Yeah, I sometimes might say the book. I guess in some ways it's a bit of like a test, in that you are dropping lots of different hints or hooks, not giving away the entire story, but enough to get people curious, enough to make them want to ask, oh, what is that book? Or to resonate. Often the coffee thing will resonate with a lot of people. That's always like an easy one, because we can't really control necessarily the questions we get asked, but we can control the answers that we give. But you can then control the questions you ask. So when you are asking people like, oh, how was your weekend? Which obviously is traditionally responded with fine or good or great. You can actually say something more, which is something which has the same essence, but is asked in a different way. So like, what was the most surprising thing about your weekend? So it's more specific, encourages people to think about a specific moment. You're also then learning something about what they might be like because of their expectations of what is surprising or not surprising.
Yeah, and it invites a story, and it invites somebody to share something about themselves that isn't perhaps the one they all would always share. You're throwing people a little bit by asking about something that is quite specific, that they have to think about it for a moment.
Exactly. And that also is really important, is they have to think about it. So I notice in conversation that people don't think, because the kinds of conversations they're having are, they know the answers to the questions. Like if I asked you, Yannick, where are you living right now?
Oh my God. Yeah, no, I know that from the back of my head. I say that all the time.
Right, you say all the time. And if I asked you, what is it like to live where you live?
See, that's a little bit different, because I can actually invite you into my space and how it feels for me to be here and my opinions about the area.
Yes. So you have to stop in your tracks because you don't know the answer. So I have to then also give you space for you to answer that kind of thing and show real curiosity. You're then invited inside yourself to experience how you actually, what it's like to live with where you are. So you're probably also learning something about yourself. So there's a discovery both for you and for me. But also the question, where do you live? It doesn't tell me anything about who you are, except that we sometimes believe that it does. Sometimes we ask the questions, what do you do? Where do you live? Where do you go to school? What did you study? Assuming that once we have this information, then we've got someone.
It paints the picture.
Except the picture you've got is always dots.
West London, one of those.
Yeah, exactly. You must be like this. Don't need to know any more about you, Yannick. I've got you sorted, right?
Well, I haven't told you yet, but you know.
You haven't yet. But I think that's the assumptions that go through our mind, is once we have these surface level facts that we understand people.
Yeah, I found myself joking, but I think I'm not joking. There's a part of me that isn't joking, because if you ask that kind of question to somebody quite early in that normally safe environment of I know all the answers to what this person might ask, I'm sure it throws people. I mean, I've seen people thrown. Usually, I like being thrown. I like people who ask a question in a different way, or they make me think quite early in the relationship. But I know, and like I would imagine, that there's a lot of people who maybe don't appreciate that kind of challenge and having to think that early in a relationship. Is there a right time to go in, or like how do you make those decisions? Whether, because you're breaching somebody's safety net in a way, somebody's comfort zone.
Yes. So one of the questions that I've often been asked is, how do you go deep fast, but where someone feels comfortable and safe to do that? And I noticed that often people have the propensity to just go straight in and ask really vulnerable questions. And two things could be challenging there. One of them is, by asking someone a question, it's a take. It's like, give me this answer. You're forcing someone to like invest, and they've got to make a decision. Do I want to share that thing? And then if the question is vulnerable, they've also then got to make another decision, which is, do I feel safe and comfortable to share that kind of thing? So I have two different strategies that help people feel safe and supported, and it helps the kind of the flow. One of them is if you are in a conversation which you want to go deeper and it's quite surface level, is to use simple things like echoing, reflecting back keywords. And this is a very classic coaching technique, right? But I like it so much because it shows people that you're hearing them and acknowledging them. You're inviting them to share something about what they think those words mean to them, which is specific to them. They also get to choose what the range of information they share is. And it just, invites people to go right down. And then the other one is not to use questions at all, but use statements. And statements are actually used all the time, but people don't really notice that they are being used. But they're conversational openers which invite people in, rather than like saying you must.
Right. So rather than asking a direct question to extract something from them, you just make a statement, or you echo back the last couple words or some keywords that you've noticed. And then they can decide whether they're going to take it and say something or ask something, or whether they can just move on.
Yes. So statements can be used both in starting a conversation, and they can also be used in like the keeping it going. When you start a conversation, you can start a statement. You can use a statement which starts with something about yourself, something about the other person, something about the environment. So by yourself, it could be like, I actually have a little bit of a dry throat right now. I'm feeling nervous. I'm feeling quite excited. I wonder what it is that is going to come next. Then the statement about the other person is, same kind of idea. You look like you've been here before. You look like you are hiding something. You look like you are having a mixed day, or you have a great sense of style. And then statements about the environment could be, the physical space that you're in, which is this event is incredibly busy. I wasn't expecting that. That person over there looks like they're up to something.
Like librarians, they always look like they're up to something.
Always. I was actually wondering what it would be like to be a librarian. The books up close all the time. I would probably want to read books more than I would sort them.
Yeah, you probably would.
Yeah.
The librarians thing became actually a thing. A couple of friends of mine kept changing the Wikipedia article and tried to establish that librarians, they führen something im Schilde. It's a German translation that they're up to something, but you don't quite know what it is. But they're planning. It never got through into the Wikipedia article.
I'm sorry to hear that. But you see how even within this moment that the statement has allowed someone else to then add something and invest. It's like it's an improvisation technique, which is, you're adding, it's yes and.
Right.
And you're inviting somebody into your own world. By sharing the statements, you're saying, this is how I think or I feel. And then the person's going, oh yes, I acknowledge that. And I'm going to add something about how I see the world.
Right, and some of these statements are like blatantly just putting an assumption out or just noticing something, but perhaps with an interpretation already in it. So you're not scared to put something out there, even though, it might be wrong. It's like, actually, this way or that way, or, maybe I have a different opinion about this event, or I perceive this differently. Like, how bold are you, and how do you make those decisions?
When I first started doing this, I took a lot less risks and didn't share that much about my world in the statements because I didn't want to be seen as weird. And then I decided I would start testing the weird ground. And I realized that if you say the weird things with conviction and you're consistent and confident, then actually people quite like that. There's something about that which makes them realize, like, it definitely... it can stop people in their tracks, let's say. But then they realize, oh, okay, I'm invited to do something different here. I'm totally okay with that. And then they often respond with something that's weird themselves. So in fact, you're taking them out of the norm of, we've got to behave very professionally and carefully, and actually we can show a bit more of ourselves. And I don't have standard statements. Obviously the 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 is quite useful when I don't feel like creating a new one. But I always try and be original because it's fun. It's like it forces me to use my creativity muscle and to look around. And looking around, you said earlier, wonder. This is exactly what it is. It's encouraging people to be curious about the world around them, about themselves, and actually share something that they're thinking about or feeling about in response to it. So you'll never, ever, ever run out of things to say if you're curious and if you wonder.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest strength of any coach anyway. So most coaches hopefully will already be having developed or be blessed with a healthy sense of curiosity. And that I wonder phrase, it's such a powerful thing. I mean, in coaching alone, it's already a super powerful thing and we use it all the time. It's like, oh, I wonder. It's not saying that I demand an answer for you. I'm just expressing my curiosity here. And I think it's getting transferred into normal conversations, quote unquote, like definitely not often enough, because it's so easy to wonder about something and it really doesn't, like, it shouldn't at least make anybody feel pressured to wonder about the thing also, or to join into the wonder or to have some answers, even though I think a lot of people probably would react in a way that, oh, that person wonders, therefore I must know the answer.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of clever contracting goes on around that? Or have you had experiences with that sense of? I mean, we're living in the UK, right? And I'm saying that because culturally, there's a lot more resistance to just kind of join into a random interaction with somebody, especially with somebody who might seem a little weird. So I think we can use those kind of harsh training grounds, because if it works here, it'll probably work anywhere. So I wonder if there is anything that can be done to kind of make people safer, respond to the weirdness, come with us into the space of curiosity.
So with the statements, often before sharing the I wonder part, I make a statement about what I notice and my experience of what I notice. It was one time I was in this co-working space, and I looked around the room and I saw these plants that were hanging upside down. And I suddenly noticed that they were upside down. I thought, that's really interesting. So I said, gosh, these plants are upside down. And then, of course, the question that arrived in my mind at that point was, I wonder how they get water. How do you feed an upside down plant? And what happened with the guy opposite me, the statement about the noticing forced him to then look and then notice, and he hadn't noticed it before as well. There was a natural break whilst I was actually thinking. I then just shared my question, but because it wasn't directed at him, but he was in the vicinity, I think for him it felt like there was an opportunity where he could respond, but he didn't have to. I wasn't saying to him, why do you think they're like that? Which would also have the assumption of that he should know or might know.
Hey, you, Thomas.
Yeah.
Give us the answer to the plants. Yeah, but like it allows somebody to be safe in their place, and they can join a conversation or they cannot do so.
Exactly. It's like I see it as you're opening up the space in between people rather than directing it at them. And that's like a very coaching thing as well, is you've just got this like something that's mixture of both you and them that they can join or not join as they see fit. And there's a minimum requirement. So rather than me saying, I need an answer to why the plants are upside down and how that works, they could simply say, oh, I don't know. And that is an investment. They're still having a conversation with me.
Yeah. Or they say, yeah, good question.
Yeah,
then you're in the space of wondering together, and then maybe somebody else can join in who might have overheard it,
Right.
And this is where I really appreciate people who are aware of this kind of stuff and they know how to create spaces like this. Because at a network event, for example, or at an event where there's more than one person, and you find yourself talking to somebody and you're talking to that person in that way, it's easy for other people to be able to join into the conversation. How often have I been at events and I'm like just standing maybe kind of close to a group of people. They look like cool, interesting people, but there's no way to get into the conversation. So if somebody's, emotionally smart enough and communicatively smart enough, I'm not sure if that's a word, but to create a space in that way, then it's inclusive. It's welcoming for other people to join in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big thing, inclusivity as well. I think I noticed in conversations that they often get dominated by the loudest speaker, or often an extroverted kind of person. But actually, I would call myself more introverted, or at least in the past I have been. I never felt like I had, I don't know if it's confidence, but I never felt like it was the right time for me to just butt in and etc. So all of the tools I developed were, okay, how can I facilitate the space where I feel like I'm equals with my conversation partner? And a lot of the time that means knowing when to shut up, but also it means knowing when to invite people and direct things towards their way. So for instance, if you make a comment about wandering and no one picks it up, perhaps because they're not sure whether it's okay for them to say something, you can then say a follow-up actual direct question. Hey, do you know why the plants are upside down and how they get watered?
Or what do you think? It implies like you don't actually have to know the answer. You can just wildly speculate. Yeah,
exactly. And that's fine then. And like not being attached as well to needing to find out why the plants are upside down is also important. It could just be a moment of like just a laughter.
Yeah, excellent. And when you are in a space and you would want to enter a conversational space, I'm just thinking about that kind of networking event scenario. You know, if there's 2 or 3 people and they seem to have a conversation, is there a way to start a conversation with people who are already talking?
So there's a few different things going on here. One of them is that if they're already in a conversation, you've got to find an entry point to be able to join. And that could be also the physical entry point, like where is there actual space in that group. A lot of the time people do this thing where they kind of very quietly sneak up and slit in. It can work. My own preference is not to do that, because I often find that the people who just invite themselves kind of in and don't say anything often aren't included. So there isn't a natural facilitator that steps up and says, hey, come join our group. So my assumption is that there'll never be a good facilitator, so I have to introduce myself. So I will be consistent, and I will go with confidence and say, okay, hey, sorry to interrupt you, may I join your conversation? And by that point, generally people don't want to be rude, so they say, sure, yeah, exactly. And then I either make the decision, I'll shut up and listen. So I will like, or I might even say, hey, don't feel the need to backtrack. I'll just I'll just listen in. I say something more eloquent than that. I can't think of what I say right now. But essentially the idea is often people feel like they have to give you a complete rehearsal, or they have to then ask you who you are, what you're doing there, which then changes the conversation tangent.
Right.
I'd rather stay on where people are at. And then if I'm listening well enough, I can understand, okay, what is it that we're talking about roughly? What are the also the dynamics at play here? Who's doing the speaking? And then I can find something where I can contribute. So I can meet them where they're at rather than change them off into a new direction, which I can do afterwards.
Right. Yeah. So rather than just kind of sneaking in, it's important to actually acknowledge that you're joining, asking for permission, even if they don't give it to you. I had that scenario once. I kind of introduced myself and just like, hey, you look like I have a really interesting conversation. Do you mind if I join? And they're like, oh, yeah. And then I just was stuck in this group being completely ignored because clearly they weren't really up for having somebody else in the group. But just these little bits of contracting. It's like, oh, don't feel obliged to go back. I'll find my way in, or whatever you might want to say, must only take a moment, and then everybody kind of feels safe with you around because they know they don't really have to do something about you.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. I've been thinking a lot about awkwardness these days, and I think awkwardness is when you're not sure what the norm is or the way to behave. And so everyone is kind of shifting themselves a little bit left, a little bit right. Should I do a bit more of this, a bit left of this, waiting for the thing that feels like comfortable. And actually, awkwardness doesn't happen when you know somebody well, because you know how they're going to behave roughly. You know the context. So a way around awkwardness I've discovered is just going for the way that I want it to be. And then people just follow suit. And of course, it depends on the context. Sometimes when I am the only person in a context, everyone else knows each other, then I'm not going to completely just change the setup. But I am going to be myself. But how much of myself I might be listening in to see, okay, what are the norms here? How do people show up and behave? But most of the time, especially like things like Zoom, there's no context. It's a box. You've got to, and you might know who the person is from based on like how you met them or how you organize the call. But generally, we're looking at each other to work out how am I actually behaving? Oh, okay. So if you see someone else showing up in a particular way, you might think, oh, okay, they're the kind of person that likes being really personable and being at ease and comfortable with themselves. That means that I can be the same as well. So the principle here is go first. Show up how you want to show up, and people will follow.
Interesting. Wow. There's so many places we could go next, but I think the thing is that we make so many assumptions about what the space is in which we are meeting, that, I didn't really recognize how much that contributes to how safe we feel and how we might start those kind of conversations. If you set up an event in a way where people are just confused about what this is, just kind of coming into a space, and then there's there's cocktails or whatever, and then you later go into the main event. If you book an event that people already know, it just feels so much more safe. And if you don't kind of have that, and you didn't establish those ground rules, so even in the kind of circumstances that you meet somebody, even if you haven't met that person before, if you meet somebody at a festival, or you meet somebody at a conference, or you meet somebody at a network lunch, there's all of these assumptions about how we are supposed to behave here. What kind of language do we speak with each other? And yeah, all of that safety gets people to open up, or maybe not to open up in the scenario of like a corporate event, for example. What I'm thinking about now, what I'm wondering is when to break with that, and when it's actually important. If I kind of break the rules, somebody might feel less safe and less likely to be more open with me and show me who they are. But it might also be the opposite. So getting that balance right seems to be really important.
Yeah. And I think that there is this is never binary, right? It's always on a spectrum, and any moment by moment, things change. So it's about being able to read the moment, and as you would as a good coach, and be like, okay, so something is not landing here. Either, if you're speaking to somebody and they look uncomfortable, it could be something you said, or it could be something completely else, which you haven't found out what that is yet. So in many situations, I was going to say I go for the tame version of myself, but I actually don't know what the tame version is these days, because someone said to me that I was pretty weird, and that came as a bit of a shock, because I don't consider myself to be weird at all, but I'm so used to myself now that I don't know what that is. I generally show up in a way I feel which is confident and true to myself, but I may not be as loud or as I was going to say domineering as I potentially could be. I sort of like, I'm sitting to wait to find out what is the culture here. It's really interesting, because it's a really fine line, because if you sit and wait too much and don't be confident and don't be consistent with who you are, then that awkwardness can then keep happening, because everyone else is looking around thinking, okay, what is the way I want to behave? But if you overdo it, then you can sort of feel like you're not going to belong, and people might push you away. Generally, I find that the latter is always better, which is to be more confident and consistent, and then adapt your style, rather than start the other end being more timid. Because then at least people see you, and they actually notice you. And as you said earlier, like joining a conversation circle, generally the default is non-memorable. If you think about all the people you've met in networking events or any kind of events, you probably don't remember the most of them, right? And actually that is something which I found very frustrating. So I realized, okay, well, let's get past this, which is just be yourself, show up, be confident, but also be confident in a way that doesn't take people's space, like be a really great listener.
Yeah, confident means showing up and actually really good listening as well. But I'm sure you will have plenty of people in your courses, or people who want to learn to be more outgoing and be more confident in that way, to take the first step to meet somebody. That is such a good skill in so many different ways, not just business or coaching clients, but also friendships. I mean, how many people have I coached who moved into a different part of the world and they don't really know people there, and it seems to be so difficult to just go and say hi to somebody, or to just like start up a conversation. And if everybody was confident, it would be so easy. But there's something there that as soon as we show up and we tell people who we are, we make ourselves also incredibly vulnerable. Because what if they don't like us and we showed them who we really are? Then they really don't like us, So I wonder what it is there that we could do to either improve confidence. And I know this is a huge question, but very practically, whether there's ways in which we could do that in a safer way than just going to the next network event and just kind of, committing to say hi to a bunch of people, which is, I'm sure, something that many people would say that's just not available to me ontologically. I'm just like, I know you can give me all the tools of what I would need to say, but like, I still wouldn't do it just because I don't want to show up, real, because it makes me vulnerable.
Well, this sounds to me like a question of beliefs. What are our beliefs about ourselves, the other people, and the environment? And often people have quite limiting beliefs around, being likable, and really like wanting to be liked, but also almost to the point where the beliefs might be so hard to meet. Like, sometimes people, I think I used to have a limiting belief, which was like, I'm not likable, but like extending it to a large number of people, which I think it's almost impossible to be liked by everybody.
Almost. Wait, there's a way?
Yeah, almost impossible. In fact, I've reframed that belief to like, people who I have similar values to might like me, but I don't need to be liked by everybody. And actually that gave me a lot of permission to realize that I don't have to get on with everybody. And now I can show up to networking events that I feel completely disconnected from the people, and that'd be okay. Because rather than like, oh, I failed, I didn't like find a way to connect with them, it can be like, well, one, it wasn't a great day, or two, I just simply don't vibe with those kind of people that often. They're not meant to be my best friend. So letting myself off the hook and actually giving myself permission not to be liked by everybody is a really valuable thing. I think that often what happens with interactions is that you have this really interesting feedback loop where you see someone's behavior, which is, let's say, disconnected. They look like they're not looking at you. They're not really smiling at you. They're probably looking past you, right? And especially when you've just told them what your job is. So this used to happen to me all the time when I was a project manager. I liked my job. They asked me what my job was. I told them I was a project manager, and I could see the eyes glaze over of like, oh, I'm not interested in this person or this conversation anymore. It used to really frustrate me because I liked my job. And also I realized I am not my job. That's one of the things I do in my life. So actually realizing that response is nothing to do with me was so important. It was like, oh, okay, they're just judging you maybe based on your job, but actually it doesn't really matter because when they get to know who you really are, they will like you. Rather than what is often an easy thing to do is see somebody have a negative nonverbal response and then be like, oh, they're not interested in me because I'm boring. Because I'm interesting. I'm a not interesting person. I'm not really a great person at all. I don't even know why they want to be friends. I mean, you may not say this, it's an internal dialogue, right?
Yeah. Totally reinforcing the dialogue, but based on not real information. Exactly.
So you're reinforcing it. And because of that, you're probably losing confidence, feeling more awkward, which then encourages the other person to potentially not connect with you and interact with you. So it's a bit of a self-fulfilling dialogue, which is a bit shit, really. Whilst actually, the thing is that other people's feedback, verbal and non-verbal feedback, is valuable, but not to the point where you let it become about you.
And how quickly do we tend to make this connection? Or somebody's crossing their arms, or they're just like their attention went elsewhere. It could have been literally 1,000 different reasons other than you're a boring person. It's much more likely that, they've got distracted, their phone vibrated in their pocket and they wonder who it was. Literally there's so many explanations as to why this person's attention has just gone away for a moment. But how quickly are we to reinforce that negative story that we have heard ourselves?
Oh, so quick. And I must say, this is one of the biggest lessons I learned from, I did some training in deception and credibility. And
deception and incredibility?
And credibility.
Oh, I wanted incredibility.
Incredibility. Well, I suppose you could say back there as well.
It's okay. We'll do something about incredibility later.
Okay. And one of the reasons why people are really poor lie detectors is because they go from collect data to conclusion. It's like, oh, they're crossing their arms, therefore they're lying. without considering all the hypotheses for why they might be crossing their arms. So the way I kind of deal with this in my head is I go through a process where it's like, okay, like the data, what am I seeing? I'm seeing arms crossed, I'm seeing screwy face. What are the hypotheses for why they might be doing this? Consider, okay, they are cold. Something just happened in their head, which is unrelated to you, and it's made them shift. You said something which made them feel uncomfortable. That could be one of the hypotheses. It's not necessarily a hypothesis. And run through them. And then I can be in a better situation to be like, oh, okay, this might be me. It also might not be me. I can make a better decision rather than the classic thing, which is they don't like me.
Yeah. Yeah, I love sometimes to just kind of check that back by using the storytelling analogy. It's like, oh, I'm telling myself in this scenario would be like, oh, I'm noticed that telling, it's super interesting. I noticed that I'm telling myself the story that you became not interested anymore. And I'm wondering whether it was my story or maybe there was something else or maybe you just got distracted, and then it's like, it's a different kind of conversation. And what I like just with my coaching hat on again, is like coaching is a different kind of conversation to your normal conversation. Maybe not to your normal conversation. I think your normal conversation is probably a bit more coachy. But like people are not used to somebody saying, oh, I'm noticing that I'm having these thoughts right now. Is that true? It's like, oh, I'm having this assumption that you mean this. Do you really mean that? And so bringing in these interesting bits of coaching conversation into a normal conversation and just kind of wondering what's happening right here is such an effective way, I think, to get somebody interested in what kind of conversation is this.
Yeah. I think that people think that conversations are organic, your ability to have good conversations, and that they are fairly, I don't know, surface level or something. But actually, you're still speaking to a human, and that means being aware of yourself, being aware of others, being aware of how you're managing the situation in the moment. And one thing that coaching does do is it makes people sensitive to those things and therefore able to adapt more around the other person and to adapt to the moment. And I think that's the power really that's been taught.
Right. So it makes me think about, well, what does a good conversation need to have? Because I kind of thought a lot about what a good coaching conversation needs to have, but I'm sure you've come across, I don't know, models, theories, or just from your experience, what makes a good conversation?
Yeah, I have thought about this, and I'm still trying to work out what are all the ingredients that are required for a great conversation. So here's a few that I think are helpful. One of them is driven by curiosity. And this is, crossover to coaching. But I think that a lot of people worry in conversations about running out of things to say or things to explore. But in my experience, I never ever run out of things to say and explore because you're always discovering. That's the beauty of the great conversation, is that you're never following a line of thought or feeling that you've had before. You might take elements that you thought about, but you're always having someone else add to it and open up new tangents that you can then explore. You can keep going and going and going and going and going, almost to the point where you have to say, right, enough is enough. Like, I'm going home and you're going home and that's it. End of conversation. And with that, I think comes also the principle of not having a destination. So different kinds of talk are oriented in different ways because often they're around goals. Like you think about a coaching conversation to a degree, sales conversation, a leadership business management conversation. You are trying to communicate something or get something specific across. Whilst in more, I'd say, social conversations, it's quite open, the field. And there's a real virtue to that, which means you can kind of go anywhere. And in fact, if you're trying to go somewhere so specific, then you might then not be listening in the present moment and pick up and all the different things that are showing up that could then lead you to another place. And I think that is one of the challenges, is that people feel like they have this map. They're like, okay, let's go down this way. I know what this route looks like. When actually, get rid of their map, unhelpful. Have some maybe principles at play. So for instance, the principles at play I like to play around with are moving beyond the facts and getting to feelings, experiences, ideas. and recognizing that even behind every word someone uses, I will have a set of assumptions about what that means. And my way of seeing the world and their way of seeing the world will never be the same. So how do they see that? And even things like preferences are interesting. Like, I am a runner. I have been running for years, although actually I've been injured for a number of years, haven't been able to run well. I come along and I meet another runner. And it's so easy to be like, oh yeah, I'm a runner too. Yeah, I really resonate with that. Oh, and it's almost a conversation killer, because the reasons why they run, probably not the same as mine. Their experience of running, not the same as mine. Their actual experiences in real life of what running has meant to them, not the same as mine. So if I get to run down the funnel of let's talk about running and wow, we've got that in common, then actually we might close the conversation earlier.
Yeah, and endless opportunities for conversation there. Like one of the worst fears now, that I really can't say that, but like something I'm dreading is when I might say, "Oh, I'm a coach," and they're like, "Ah, okay, cool." And I'm like, "Oh shit," because I have literally no idea in what category they've just put me. Yeah. You know, am I Tony Robbins? Am I Jonathan Passmore? Am I their kids' high school coach in football? You just never know. But if somebody on the other side, if somebody says, "Oh yeah, I'm an accountant," I would really want to know what that means to them and what kind of accountant they are and like what got them into it. And it might just all be, well, I'm an accountant, just take it. Just put me in your category so we can actually talk about something that interests me. Because I think there's an assumption also that, you know, when I'm being curious about something and they just didn't really want to talk about it, to just let that be okay. What I find really difficult though is when I find myself in a conversation with people who aren't really curious and they only kind of tell me stories where they've already made up their mind about. And when I ask a question about, you know, probing a little bit further, they just tell me again what their opinion was just a minute ago. It's just in more detail. Or they kind of double down on their opinion rather than let it be challenged. Or like I wonder when you find yourself into that space with people who are just not that curious and they're not really so receptive, just kind of move on to somebody who you feel you might vibe more, or what happens if you're next to a dinner party with a person who's like that and they clearly don't really give you the signs that they want to be a bit vulnerable or they not really reacting to your curiosity. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's frustrating, right? So sometimes when I'm in a conversation, I get the sense that I'm never going to be asked a question. And that this used to frustrate me a lot. And I realized that I was in part playing into it because I wasn't really sharing anything about myself, anything personal. So one element of it is actually recognizing, I could help them become curious by giving them things to be curious about.
Which some of these openings that we talked about, like just saying something, making a statement so it's easy for them to ask, which I guess feels safer to ask about you than to give anything from them, right?
Yes. And you're also, you know, making it really easy because you're being vulnerable first with them. So like, you know, saying I'm a coach might not be much of a hook, but if you talk about the fact that you're into positive existentialism, which kind of is a new thing because existentialism is meant to be really negative, but actually it's really not. You know, the story behind that gets people in and invited. And in fact, you know, at that point, you can even ask questions that might invite people to think about how much of an existentialist they are or not. So that's one element of things. The other one is sometimes I realize, you know, I'm not going to have this conversation is not going to be one where people are going to ask me many questions. And I'm okay with that. Like, I'm instead use it as an opportunity to learn about this person and how they see the world. And if they're not answering my questions or not giving me the kinds of answers that I might want, the depth that is, then I might use something which is called labeling. You know, so I kind of almost put words in their mouth, like, oh, it sounds like you felt like this, or you were probably thinking, or you about, I don't know, whatever the context was. But I'm putting my assumptions out there so that they can then say yes if they actually felt like that, or to correct me.
And they probably would want to correct you on a bunch of your assumptions.
Most people want to correct you. So even if it's not the right thing, by putting something out there, they'll then tell you what the right thing is.
Oh, right. So they're like, I don't really want to talk to that person, but I can't let them hold the wrong assumption about me. So I guess now we're talking.
Yeah, and now exactly. And yeah, it does seem to be it's a more indirect way of getting people to share things, essentially. And the echoing, you know, as we talked about earlier, that's another one. You just say a bit more, and then by asking a few questions, echoing, shouting up, people will talk.
Yeah. I've never had anybody not say more when I asked them to say a bit more. I don't think ever. Nobody's ever said, no, that's it, really.
Yeah. People like talking about themselves, really. So as long as it's not a conflict where, you know, you're trying to steal back and get them to say something. And that's why I said it's important to realize sometimes you're not going to get to talk about yourself, and that's okay. It's honest. Also, it's not that interesting to talk about yourself. I find I get bored by talking about myself because I sort of feel like I know a lot about who I am. I like questions that help me think differently, but often I don't always get that. So I'm quite happy to talk about the other person.
Yeah, I get that. And on that note, what's something you're currently thinking about? Like, what's something that you would actually enjoy talking about? Because I have some more questions here, but as you're kind of giving me a nice opening, I also want to make this interesting for you. And I know you're a deep thinker. So I wonder what is going on in Georgie's mind right now.
So in my mind right now, responding to this conversation or questions that have been sitting with me for a while?
Questions you're currently thinking about, something, coaching related would be a plus, but I know anything really is coaching related if you talking to me. So I'm just wondering where your curiosity is at the moment.
Okay. So one of my curiosities right now is about projects and identities. So I'm a person who has lots of different interests in the world. And yes, I have a business around human connectivity, which has a few different kind of offerings. I'm also a coach. I do some facilitation work. I'm a community builder. I work on a board of a nonprofit. And I like having the variety in my life. But when it comes to time and energy, those things I've discovered are actually quite limited. And there's so many things that I want to be doing. So I've been asking myself, you know, what is the thing that I want to focus on right now? Can that be multiple? Can that be one thing? I'm also noticing a pattern in my life, which is always having multiple roles. Right back to when I was at school, always lots of extracurricular activities, multiple responsibilities, and really enjoying the intersection between where they overlap, because I find that it's that point where you have lots of different things where you find the creativity, or you create it, or you can see the connections. And yet I notice that there is some stress sometimes as well, because I want to be on it with everything. And unfortunately, not every day goes to plan. So the question I'm kind of sitting with at the moment is whether I could focus on less, what that less would look like. And what are the stories I'm telling myself about why I can't do less, why I need to do more, for instance.
The question resonates super well with me, and I think it resonates a lot with a lot of coaches, particularly coaches, because there aren't that many full-time coaches who do nothing but coach in a particular area or with a particular approach. You know, coaching is inherently integrative, and most coaches, almost all coaches, will have multiple hats. You know, either also as a speaker, or also as a manager, or also as a leader, or even the coaches do it full time. Most of them will also be the marketeer, and also be the brand manager, and also be the accountant, and also be the outreach network and salesperson, and then also the person who delivers the service. So I think we're all having these multiple roles, and by definition, we're more productive if we're only doing one thing, right? But as a fellow, what I would call multi-potentialite, somebody with a portfolio career and a generalist, I actually really enjoy having all of these different hats, and I like the variety that comes with it. But by definition, we're more effective if we focus all of our attention, all our energy on one thing and one thing only. That's why we have these masters of a particular craft that, if you were to study and do nothing but one movement with your hand, then you're gonna be one of the best at that thing. Now with coaching, that doesn't really work like that, because we have to have multiple different sort of skills. We're not just a conversation starter. We're also somebody who holds a process, and we're also a listener. We're also a communicator. We're somebody who provides feedback, and we're somebody who holds somebody to account, perhaps. We have all these different hats that we're already bringing together. So now how do we pick the 1 or the 5 or the 15 things that we're going to turn our energy towards? And what else do we let go? Personally, I just kind of came to embrace the fact that I'm building 3-4 different things at the same time, and that all of them are going to take less time, more time than they would have if I had concentrated on them and did nothing but, and then move on to the next thing. So I think that kind of acceptance that we have limited attention span and availability and energy and resources, and just make some informed decisions on whether you're going to choose to do one thing only for, even if it's just 5 minutes or 20 minutes to work on a task, or whether it's a couple of months or a couple of years, if it's about something like building a practice or a job or a business. I'm not sure what it was. How do we balance and navigate that? And part of that is by coming to terms with what you're doing and just being quite aware, and then making this decision that is informed by the consequences of our actions.
Yeah, well said. There's a lot in there I also agree with. And it is a major, I think, coaching problem in that, you're not just a coach, you are running a business. And there's lots of different hats there, and perhaps even hats that you don't even like wearing. Mm-hmm. I know personally I'm not really a fan of marketing, and I've always been battling with that. And yet it is something that you have to do. And also that the way I'm also seeing things right now is I don't have to love everything I do. Like, I'm never probably going to reach a point where 100% of every waking moment of my life is going to be wonderful. And that is the reality. And it's actually okay to have parts of the day or the week that are like not the most exciting thing, but I do it because it's part of the process of being human. And if I can come to terms with that, then that's okay. And I do things because in the end, they give me meaning. The greater whole gives me meaning.
Mm-hmm. There was something I wanted to pick you up on. It was about our coaching work. Often the coach is there to really focus that person's work, not just a conversation, but that person's work or life, onto something that is quite concrete in the future. And we try to be very specific, very smart around the goal or where this conversation or where this person is going. And in order to accelerate that kind of change and growth process, the traditional sort of coaching would help you to cut out all the other distractions and really just focus on one thing and one thing only. And I almost worked with a business coach like that who said, look, the way that I would make you successful is I would cut out 90% of what you do currently. And really focus on that one thing with that very specific demographic target group. And I have no doubt that it would have worked defined by the success of the business. But I would have been miserable. I would have not seen this through because I know that I want that kind of variety. So I have to make different decisions than the ones informed by you should only do one thing and one thing only. The kind of essentialism, become a master of that one thing and be the best in the world at it. And then people can't ignore you any longer. And we still have a lot in coaching that is focused on helping people do just that, climb one tree to the very top. When actually, I see myself more of an expert on the foundations of the forest, perhaps. You can do trees for a little while, and then you look into bushes, and then there's tons of diversity within that. So I don't think I've climbed any tree to the top yet, even within things I really focused on, like coaching or existentialism or positive psychology. I'm far from where other people are who climbed the same tree, for way longer than me. But I think it's important that we have people who know the foundations a little bit more. And, you don't need to necessarily look at this vertically, climbing a tree to the top, but you can climb, across the horizontal axis, and you become a different kind of master. And I think when we allow ourselves to see that, then it becomes a lot less pressure to be that kind of climbing one tree to the top kind of person.
Yeah, there's definitely a philosophy which seems to be the winner right now, which is the essentialism focus, do one thing. And I'm not sure it's the only one available, or at least not to everybody. I think I keep hearing the words of Warren Buffett, like have the list of 20 things you want to do in your life, cross them all off, and keep the only top 5. And I think there's a lot of virtues to it, but I'm not sure how doable it is for some people.
Say a bit more about that, because by definition, it's so true, right? If you do nothing but the one thing, then you can do a lot more in that one area, and you're going to be a lot more focused, and there's a lot of benefits to eliminating all the other distractions. I think there's a lot of life in the distractions. There's a lot of stories that you will tell your grandkids about in that detour you've done that seemingly for no reason led nowhere.
Well, okay, so I think there's different questions being asked here.
Oh yeah.
One of them is do one thing mentality, right? My question behind that is this about goals or is this about time? Because if I'm doing a task, I should probably just do one task at any given moment in time, because multitasking isn't actually a thing. So perhaps, it means that. I probably can agree with that, do one thing at a time. Then the do one thing under the banner of whatever job you have and being a professional. Does that mean do one thing 5 days a week? Does that mean doing one thing 2 days a week? Could you then have a side thing, which isn't your one thing on the side, which has less pressure around it? And I think there's also a question here of the do one thing around the what versus the how. So the what could be the umbrella thing that you offer the world, coaching, let's say. How you do that, I see a million options available. And sometimes when we're so pinned down on the how is this going to happen, we make our beautiful plan. We say nothing on the plan will find its way into my diary. I will follow the plan. And then life happens. And a new opportunity perhaps means that we can actually accelerate 3 steps ahead. But we're so focused on doing the one thing and doing it the way we thought it would, we miss out on the opportunity completely. And I'm a big fan of serendipity. I think that a lot of the things that have happened in my life that are amazing, could never have guessed that they would have happened, or when or how. I knew that something like that probably might have happened at some point in my life. I just couldn't work out exactly when and order. So I'm actually a fan of having, I guess I'd call them intentions or big life goals, but I don't get too stuck on this is how I'm going to achieve this by the age of 30 or 35 or whatever it is. I don't think it's that simple. And also it loses the magic of life. So I'm now talking, so I'm going to stop talking. I just realized I've gone off on one.
Yeah, I'm not sure where to pick you up on that. I think we're quite in agreement that it's important that we focus when we focus, to be really present with what we're doing. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson here. But that's, if we try to do 3 things at the same time, and I used to try and tell my mom that when I'm walking around with my toothbrush still in my mouth and sorting out the washing while also cleaning my desk, all of these things will get done eventually. But if I would do one thing after another, it would definitely be much more efficient.
Yeah. Well, actually, having said that, I as you were talking about the brushing your teeth, I think that you can do 2 things when you're brushing your teeth, but that one of them has to be the main intention. So brushing your teeth, main intention is clean teeth, right? The second intention is make decisions, because when you're brushing your teeth, it's the best place for your brain to start mulling over and coming up with insights. But if you try too hard for those insights to arrive, then they never arrive. So when I am trying to achieve a particular goal, like around a decision, for instance, I go and do something very physical, task oriented. And it's almost like I give myself permission to do the thinking, which is kind of a little bit driven by me, but it's also just allowing things to show up. So I do think that we do time.
But I think we can only do that with things that are already entrenched in our system, things that we know how to do, like brushing our teeth, like driving a car, for example. A lot of great ideas you have while you're driving a car. Or while you do other things that you do routinely. I know not everybody's driving, but like things that are already in your system. My hairdresser back in the day, she really impressed me by like being an active part of 3 conversations. When I thought we were having a conversation and she's really present with me, not just with cutting my hair, but also with our conversation. And then she would stop and throw in something that sounded like a really full, meaningful piece of information into another conversation, and then did it again. And I'm like, maybe this multitasking thing is a thing, because like the evidence points against it, because we're just kind of switching very quickly. But some people seem to be more able to hold certain things together. But I think in retrospect, there were probably conversations with people that she knew really well and that she already was quite involved in, something where she felt quite safe in doing it. Because if it's a new task and you're trying to do 2 new tasks at the same time, I don't think that can ever work.
I definitely agree with you on that one. Yeah, having come back to London recently, everything feels new. And I'm suddenly like, okay, how do I buy a train ticket? Got it. Make sure my bag is in the right place. Don't forget the bag. Check time. Suddenly it's all so much more intensive than it used to be, which is fascinating also as a process. I feel like I'm rediscovering London in a way I'd never seen it before, because I'm just noticing.
Interesting. Yeah. Any tips on how people can focus? Because, you tried to do a lot of different things, try to be more focused, try to be a bit more essential, I guess. Anything on your journey that has helped you? Yes.
So I am a big fan of lists. And I have a pretty tight calendar, which I then transpose into a written list every day. And I know in any given moment of time what I'm going to be focusing on. And the act of like writing it down essentially and having it in my calendar means like, okay, this is what we are doing. And depending on the nature of the work, if it's deep work, I will turn off everything else so that I'm not distracted in the same way, and I will just focus on it. And also try and make it difficult for myself to be distracted, like move my phone away. So I have to physically get up or do something else to get away from it. That's when it comes to like doing one thing at one given time. When it comes to deciding what I want to do with my life and focus on, I'm trying to get better at learning to say yes when I really want to say yes and saying no when I don't actually want it. A good trick, I think it came from one of Tim Ferriss's podcast interviews, was like, imagine it is like tomorrow, the thing. Do you want to do it? I found that to be a really helpful way to really get in touch with my actual desires as to like, do I want to do this? And if there also is resistance within me about doing something, is there a way that I can make my inner frustrated part more content with that decision? So, okay, I don't want to do this. I am going to do it, but I'm only going to do it for this amount of time. And therefore, I boundary it, essentially. And that makes it much more doable. And especially that relates back to what we were talking about, parts of your business or work you don't like doing. They still have to be done, but they're not the entire day. So I guess that's, one trick I would add as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that saying no comes up so often, and there's so many good ways to do that. There's such an art to say no to somebody in a way that they're not going to feel rejected, but actually feel really respected and honored. just really expressing how much you would want to be part of this opportunity, but like that you have different priorities at the moment, or imagining it is tomorrow. Like, first of all, becoming clear whether we want to say yes or no to this, and not just saying it because we feel obliged. That's the one thing, but then how to communicate to somebody with the utmost respect that, you don't want to do that. I see so many people who just, lie and just make an excuse not to make the other person feel bad about it. And it's certainly something I've done before, because it feels easier. But then actually later on, we have to remember so many things. And it connects again with something you said earlier, which is just to be yourself and be really authentic with it. Another thing that I got from Tim Ferriss was I'm taking a break from, this, that, or the other. I'm taking a break from having new conversations. I'm taking a break from, meeting people outside of XYZ industry. I'm taking a break from saying yes to too many conversations. Can we book something in for May? Or something like that. That I found really helpful.
Yeah, that's a really good phrasing as well. And it has been on my mind a lot recently with taking time off, because I've realized that if we're like taking time off, but our mind is still stuck in having to make decisions or think about things or have something in the diary, then I'm not really off, to be honest. And I'm not resetting and then performing at my best. And I've realized personally that if I don't set my boundaries up front and be really clear about them, then people just aren't going to know what they are. And therefore any resentment which I feel towards them probably won't be very warranted, because I didn't really pre-warn anybody. So things such as like having out of office on when I'm actually away, and saying like, I don't do evening calls, for instance, like just setting my boundary, like, these are the times that I speak to people in the week. Otherwise, no, unless it's urgent. Actually, I found the more I practice it, the more people actually are fine at meeting those things. But you don't realize that until you actually say it.
Yeah, I love that. I think from reading the 4-Hour Work Week, when he was talking about how do you remove yourself from so much email, and just by helping people to understand what your boundaries are. And if your boundaries are, I'll get back to your email on Tuesday or on Thursday, or, it might take me a week, or whatever rule you're establishing. And then you leave your phone number for emergencies and somebody calls you. He's like, well, make it sound like an emergency. Don't say, yes, hello. Oh, so great you called, blah, blah, blah. No, it's like, say, what do you want? This is an emergency, right? Or you might say it in like different words, but you're like, hey, how can I help you? So people start learning that, these are not just words in an email, or they're not just, boundaries that somebody just kind of says. They're actually to be taken seriously. And with lots of people not respecting their own boundaries, people can learn that something you might put forward in a you thought really clear way might just be ignored by people, because so many people ignore them, and it just kind of becomes a new norm. So somebody has to learn that you're taking those boundaries serious, whatever they are. And then if you're consistent about it, well, people learn, and it'll take some time to get used to it, but then people know where they're at.
Yeah, this is, I have been thinking about this as well, because I noticed that, even by not stating your behavior, but behaving the way you do, you then set expectations. So like, even if someone sends you a message and you reply within an hour, you're often then setting an expectation that that's how you do things. You get back to them ASAP. So sometimes I know what I want to say to somebody, but I just won't reply to them for 24 hours at least. Unless it's urgent. Like, triaging it, right? If it's to do with setting up a time or something which is very urgent, I'll get back to people. But otherwise, I just feel like I'm constantly in reactive mode. And it was actually really funny. I had a conversation, a sort of dating-esque conversation on WhatsApp, and this guy had messaged me and I had not responded to his message. I saw it and I was like, mental note, at the end of today I will get back to this person, and also I'll make a more meaningful response rather than just in the moment. And they took that quite badly, they then made a comment which was like, oh, obviously that didn't land very well. And I was thinking, oh, okay, the fact that they saw that I'd seen the message but hadn't replied, for them had translated to then. But for me, it was like, I know I'm going to respond to you at the end of the day. I'm not going to. It was just fascinating to hear and see the different ways that people have the assumptions they have.
Yeah, and it can be something quite simple as, what is it, 2 blue ticks from somebody who's already seen the message or not seen the message. And it makes a huge difference to people whether somebody's seen your message and then decided not to respond for whatever reason, because I found myself certainly worrying about wait, if I make this unread, will it show up to the other person as unread? And sometimes I put it on unread just so the other person thinks I haven't read it yet, because otherwise they might be offended that I don't respond immediately, And sometimes I feel, oh, maybe I should say, one of these small contracting bits we talked about. Do I say, oh, you catch me in a great moment, I have a pocket of time to respond to this now, instead of just responding so they take the rule for granted? Or, do I go back and make it look unread even though I've read it, just to, stop somebody else's making assumptions? All these little contracting bits we can have, not just with people in coaching conversations, but people in general in conversations. These little coaching elements, like contracting about. It's checking in, it's oh, how funny was that? I hadn't responded to the message, but I hadn't seen that. I wonder what was going on for you as you thought I'd read it or not. These kind of little check-ins based on curiosity. These little contracting bits can come in so handy on across the range of being a human.
Yeah, actually, I wish we had more of this in relationships generally, rather than it being you say something when something goes wrong or when you really are going to lose it. To actually have every month we chat and we check in and see how are we meeting each other's needs? Are we annoying each other? What is a different behavior that you could do? And I really like these points of stopping and reflection rituals, and also the collaborative nature of it, because again, it's, as you said, driven by curiosity, and it's creating a safe space more than anything. And we don't really seem to have these rituals that often, except in things like coaching.
Yeah, in coaching, hopefully coaches would check into the relationship regularly, whether that's at the end of each session and just trying to hey, how are we doing? Is this still working? Are you getting what you want? How are you experiencing the space? Are we on track? Is this what you expected? There's a ton of different ways in which we can check into the relationship, and coaches would usually do that with their clients, but we don't really do that as friends. Maybe occasionally we would, if we haven't heard from each other in a while, or something maybe has been a bit weird, or usually we feel we need a reason to check into how we're doing, and maybe in a relationship of friends or partners, it's less of a question of, does this meet your expectations, or are we still working on the thing that you came here to work with? But generally, how are you doing in this relationship? It's such a meaningful question that we just don't ask.
Yeah, and if we did, we then have an opportunity to open out all the assumptions that are going on, which are most likely not true. And I think I won't say all the coaching tools I've learned, but one of the key things I take from the coaching journey is, what is the story that I am telling myself right now about what's happening? And you said that earlier, right? It is the most useful thing to stop yourself in the tracks and identifying with the story. Okay, am I identifying with that story? What's another story that I can tell myself? And also just being really open about that. I've actually had friendships where I then use those phrases hey, so this happened. The story I'm telling myself about this is this. Am I correct, or am I missing something?
Yeah, and what an elegant way to ask somebody else whether that's, an accurate story to tell myself. Because you might genuinely just not be very certain, but it might be spot on. It's if you think your friend is angry at you, or you think that your client is not telling you the truth, instead of saying, you're angry at me, or you're not telling me the truth, to say, It's interesting. I'm telling myself this story that you're not telling me that you're not being completely truthful with me. I'm telling myself the story that you're angry at me based on this and this information. And usually you don't even say anything. They will, respond to that, regardless of whether it's a friend or a client. But what an elegant way to just put your experience on the table. But sometimes the experience itself is already threatening people, and they get quite offensive just by you putting the experience on the table. But if it's done in a genuine way and in a non-threatening way from a position of curiosity, if somebody gets angry and defensive at that, you have another cycle. It's like, oh, I noticed that I, put the story I'm telling myself on the table. I was quite curious, but now I'm telling myself the story that you're getting super defensive about it because, I think like that my checking checking my story has made you feel threatened by this, a different story. But I think it's generally a super elegant way. I guess there's a question in there in terms of when somebody does get threatened or defensive by you just putting your experience on the table. How do you deal with that?
I had this experience actually once on an authentic relating course, and it was a really jarring experience, but I learned a lot from it. It was in a break time, and the guy I was talking to, we were kind of we were being playful in a witty way, and I can't remember something I said anyway, hit him in a particular way, and it shut him down. And he said, I've noticed I'm feeling a bit reclusive or a desire to kind of be a bit disconnected. And I then asked him another question, which was oh, why? What happened? And he then said, I'm still feeling quite put back by this. So I then changed tack and was like, oh, you're feeling disconnected because I said something. And he said, yeah, I'm feeling really disconnected. And then I started saying, oh, what else are you feeling? And I started labeling experiences he might be having. And rather than asking him questions, simply just saying, is this your experience you're having? It's just labeling the experience, the fact he's feeling disconnected, allowed us to bridge that gap and feel more connected. So I've noticed when I disconnect from somebody and I say something which feels jarring, rather than actually ask more questions about it, just simply staying in the space of me trying to be empathetic and understanding what they're feeling like right now is what's needed.
Yeah.
You look like you're considering something deeply.
Yeah, I'm wondering, partly is that I'm putting myself into that kind of scenario, and then in the back of my mind, I'm wondering what might coaches be particularly interested in regarding this? Because if you're in a one-to-one situation, in a one-to-one kind of space, you would probably have that sort of trust. You would probably know what to do in that space. So I'm not sure where to take this, because empathy, being really present, being really curious, and not having the courage to share your own experience and explore what we can do with this that's happening between the two of us. That's really the core tools of a coach. So I'm still not sure where I'm taking this, but maybe some of it resonated, so we can, it moves on.
Yeah. Well, maybe as a meta reflection then of what's happening at this point in the conversation is that we're coming to a kind of natural ending around a particular subject, if we don't necessarily know where to go. And it's interesting, it feels interesting because there can be that awkwardness, or that noticing a change in dynamic or shifting of patterns and rhythm, etc. And one thing I'm reflecting on is what do you do with that? Do you just stay with it? Do you pick up somewhere else? I'm perhaps gonna my view on this is that those moments are actually can be really precious in a really positive light. because it doesn't feel like we have to fill that space with something. We can just move off into a new direction. Again, accepting that if the conversation doesn't have to have a particular goal in mind, doesn't matter where else we go. I mean, I know that this does have a somewhat set of goals because it's for a particular kind of audience and you want it to be about coaching.
That's why it probably was in the back of my head.
Yeah.
You know, the other urge I've had in that moment was, I think we could be done here. I don't really feel the need that I need to spin this particular thread any further. You know, is there a question from you that I feel obliged to answer? And I don't think it is. We had that kind of contract before that we're just talking, you know, and we make it relevant to coaches. That is kind of my, that somewhere there. I had considered looking at my set of like kind of topics or questions that we could kind of go into something different. I guess part of me just wanted to pick something up there and then perhaps connect it to something else, a point of curiosity that would appear without me looking at my list, that would just kind of smoothly bring it to somewhere else. But I really loved what came out of it because you can sometimes just like stop and then you think about, well, what is another topic? What is something else that I'm curious about? And just really take that time, perhaps even saying, well, what else could we talk about? You know, even just kind of acknowledging it, or just sit there in some silence and see what that feels like. What a super cool thing to explore, you know, can I be comfortable with this person being silent?
Yeah.
Because this is one of the best moments when you're silent, but it feels good. It feels like you don't need to talk.
So much was running through my head when you were saying this. And one of the things I wanted to reflect on is the stating, I'm noticing that I don't know which way to go, or I need a bit of time, or I'm noticing I kind of want to go to a different direction. This labeling of the inner experience and the conflict is so interesting. Personally, so you know in interviews, when you get asked a question and you don't know the answer because it's not immediate, you need time to think. So I started responding to that with, that's a really great question. Just give me a moment to come up with an answer. And I felt great. All the permission for all the time I wanted to go and really think about it and reflect on it. Rather than thinking, I've got to respond straight away. And then again, in a conversation, you notice you don't want to go in the direction that it's going in. Or it's not going anywhere. Hey, I'm noticing that I'm struggling to answer that question right now. And I think it's because I'm thinking about something else. Change, pivot. It could be even dissatisfaction with like, I think I've talked about this so much that I'm out of gas. And maybe we can just go and talk about this other thing over there. I often take inspiration from walking, because when you're walking with somebody, the conversation has natural pauses. You know, and also as you're walking, you often end up talking about things that are in the environment around you, and you bring in your own experience as well as what's happened in your life. And actually, I think those make really beautiful conversations. So I'm thinking about how we transpose that concept, bring it into other conversations, and simply by adding a little bit of more signposting.
Yeah, and especially when you're walking, you have something else to do. Like you're not just sitting there looking at each other thinking. You're like kind of moving within a space, and maybe there's something else you can look at. You know, when you're walking, you're not necessarily facing each other directly. So I think in coaching, often we don't face each other directly, but in Zoom we do. You know, my coaching chairs, they're always at a bit of an angle so that at any point in time, we could just kind of gaze forward, and in front of us, there's nobody. You know, I think that's quite important. And in Zoom, we don't really do that. And I think that's why this awkwardness that we're describing happens so much more often in Zoom than when you're actually in the room with people or outside with people. You know, because like at any kind of social gathering, there will be a time when 6-7 people are in the room in close proximity and nobody's saying something. You know, and it's comfortable because I don't know, some people might be looking out the window, somebody else might be rolling a cigarette, whatever, people listening to the music, you know, whatever it is, it's comfortable to just be in the same space together. But in a Zoom conversation, when there's 6, 7 people on Zoom and nobody's talking, it's just awkward most of the time. I've never noticed like a Zoom silence with more than like 3 people who've clearly contracted that, you know, we might just kind of hang out like we used to, you know, when sometimes somebody doesn't say anything. You have to contract for these silences. But on Zoom, it immediately is awkward. And I think this is because we don't have anything else going on right now and there isn't a contract.
Yeah, contracting.
Comes back to it again, right?
Yeah, it's a bit of leadership. When you think about it in a social dynamics point of view, though, there will always be some form of leadership. There will always be an individual that will step up to play a particular role, and that might change given the nature of the situation. But it's simply becoming aware of like, okay, who is being leader right now? Who could be leader? Who could step in? It doesn't have to be one person. And in fact, often it isn't necessarily the best person. It might be the most loud person. and I also then say there's an element of self-leadership, you know, in a conversation, any kind of conversation. If you're not feeling satisfied by it, or there's a negative impact, you can ask yourself, okay, what's happening right now? What could be my role or my responsibility in the situation to take us somewhere else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and leadership doesn't mean that one person is elected leader and then they stay like this forever. You know, as soon as somebody steps in, for example, a Zoom conversation and says, hey, how about we like take 2 minutes each, you know, it's like, and people just agree to that. A contract is just an agreement between people on whatever, you know, and anybody can take that step. And contracting always takes more. It's not just a one-sided thing. It's not a leader stepping up and saying, this is how things are going to run now. But like anybody can step up at any point and ask or invite some contracting, just so we can all be a bit more sure about what this is and how we're doing it. And it can be done in such short amount of time. Like, would it be okay if I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question? You know, it's such a small way of contracting. And yes, you're probably not going to hear no necessarily, but you might hear, I've only got a minute, make it a quick one. You know, or sure. You know? It's not a no, but it's clearly like, I'm not so comfortable at this point to be asked questions by you. And then you can perhaps adjust how you ask the question or whether you still want to go ahead with it. You know, and just tiny little bits of contracting. So helpful.
Yeah, this is making me think about good facilitation, which seems to be not everywhere, let's say, but that you can yourself can get better at it by like just speaking up and saying, hey, I'm noticing I'm not feeling like we've taken the time to do this. Can we just take a break, take time to speak, especially on Zoom when it's exhausting and draining.
Yeah, what are some of those bits around contracting or facilitation? Because I know a lot of coaches are also facilitators, not just of one-to-one conversations, but in general. What are other good bits of really short contracting are there? You know, it's like, oh, I noticed to interrupt you. Is that okay? You know, or like little bits we notice and then ask for permission. You know, not all the contracting has to be done in the beginning. You know, it can be done as you're already facilitating.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a setting up at the beginning of a call of that contracting, but there's also the every 5-10 minutes checking the litmus test of how everyone is and actually making it a question that people have to answer. You know, put up a thumbs up or write in the chat how they're feeling out of 10, whether someone who hasn't spoken yet would like to speak. We need a break. Do people need a break? Even potentially suggesting things like, hey, I'm noticing that I'm feeling a bit like I need to stretch. Sure, you'll get up and stretch. And then that way you're kind of forcing people to do it, but actually people generally are quite happy. Because I think people will feel otherwise that they need to, or they have to stay at the screen, or they have to stay on mute, and they'll just stay in their default behaviors unless you get an invitation otherwise.
Did you say every 10 minutes?
Yeah, 5-10 minutes.
All right. Every 5-10 minutes, you would put something in for people to actually having to respond to it or do something. Or...
Well, it depends on what the nature is, but I think that so Zoom webinar versus a Zoom session is different, right? Webinar is about content and people are generally just listening, and there's that expectation. But if you want people to participate, then I've noticed through the screen, people shut off so much faster if they're not having to do anything or they're not expected to do anything. So I read somewhere, and I've been experimenting with myself, like, every 5-10 minutes is that you get people to do some form of activity. It could be even in a minor way, even using the chat box or something, but something to be like, to allowing them to feel like they're part of it rather than they're just like listening.
Mm-hmm. Could you give us some examples? Anything that can be done quickly and doesn't take too much time?
Well, it depends on what the session's meant to be about. Perhaps you give me an example of a context.
For example, what would you do if you tell people about conversations and it's like kind of webinar style, but there's people there and you want to engage them? So you're telling people, let's say, about new ways of approaching somebody in a network event setting.
Okay, so this is a good one because I've been thinking about this a lot. I don't do talking at events. I basically generally refuse those invitations because I don't believe that people learn very much by listening. I believe that they learn by doing. So any kind of Zoom event or actually in person, it will have workshop elements in it, and I design that in. So if I'm delivering a slide, for instance, I might talk for a few minutes, but there'll be rhetorical questions in there. There will also be questions that I will ask people to think about. Take 30 seconds to think about this, and then write your responses in the chat box, and I'll wait for that. Then as people respond, I will then speak through their responses and help weave through together. And I say, oh, that's an interesting response. Maybe Heidi, Brian, whatever their names are. You might like to say something more about that. So encourage people to come off and actually engage. So there's things like that. It might be designing a breakout exercise, and that could be even like 2 minutes. Also, my preferred style around teaching is through more Socratic means and also through more experimental means. I think the best way of learning is by doing. So I'll give people a basic principle or exercise. I'll say, go away, do that. Right, come back and tell me about your experience. And then we'll weave all the threads together. Then distill the principles based off that. So that's how I like designing my sessions. And in other contexts, I think that those kinds of things, checking assumptions, asking questions, breakout room exercises, getting people to speak, even simple things like if you're sharing a quote or a definition or something like that, is rather than just share it, say, okay, here's a definition, speak it loud. How is this landing with people? What's coming up for you? When you say this, anything which you're feeling resonates a lot, maybe you're challenged by something else. Let's take a minute to see how this lands, and then I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
Yeah, and I think it's important to plan that into your talk, because if you have a certain amount of information to deliver, it will take you a certain amount of time. I think if you put something like this in to engage people and then they're engaging and then you're just moving on with your stuff because you don't actually have time to engage people, I think that needs to be planned.
Yeah, design is really important of these kinds of experiences. I in all things, talks, workshops, really thinking about, like, if you want people to take away something, you need to get them moving and doing things.
Ooh, I'm also noticing the time,
Yes.
I know this last part. I do have a couple of questions for you. You don't know the questions yet, except for one, which I kind of slightly hinted on, but then we went on straight away into this conversation. So you didn't actually have a lot of time to think about that. I think I want to give you a bit of more space for that one, just because I feel that there might be a lot of value coming out of you. On the other hand, I would have loved to talk to you about breathwork, because I feel that breathing is such a available resource to us, and it like opens so much. It's such a very powerful intervention on so many different levels. And I think because it is, I think it deserves a lot more space than what we could potentially summarize in a minute or two. Unless there's something that you can pack into a minute or two where you think, that's what I would want people to know. And then I'll just sit here and try to not engage you more in it.
Yeah, it's good. I've actually been thinking about breathwork a lot recently because of my experiments. Okay, so I'll leave a recommendation, 2 recommendations. One of them is try Wim Hof breathing. It's also called Tumo, I think it is the idea, and it's amazing for energy, creativity, and just also exploring like what happens when you experiment with your breathing. Actually, another one is read a book called Breath by James Nestor. And then the final one, which he mentions in his book, is nose breathing is the way forward. Don't use your mouth. I have actually been experimenting the last 6 days with taping my mouth shut at night,
Wow.
which has been really fascinating. And I think it's delivering impact. I'm not sure how much mouth breathing I was doing beforehand, but it's certainly an interesting experiment as well. Just for the sake of the fact that you wake up in the middle of the night, some of them panic. I've only ripped it off twice though, so far.
Wow. Yeah. I'm just like sitting with the idea of doing that. Cool. Thank you again. It's tempting to engage you on so many levels, but I'll leave it at that. I think that might merit another conversation.
Okay.
I do have a couple of questions. Let's just kind of go through it, and you tell me in as much or little detail as you want some of the answers. I know this was on both lists. I know you love books. Your shelf is very impressive. It's the first shelf I think I've seen that is like double and sometimes triple stacked, depending on the size of the books. There's a lot, and you actually read into not read all of them, but like at least read into all of them, because you know how books are structured, and you grasp a lot of them. So you're bona fide book lover. So I would love to hear about 1 or 2 books that really influenced your coaching specifically. There's a lot of books that can influence us, but something that has made an impact on the way that you coach.
Yeah, good question. Okay, so one I read many years ago is the book by Nancy Klein.
Time to Think?
Time to Think, yeah. And she also has a follow-up, which I have got, but not yet read all of it. And she talks about this idea of like thinking partners and also the space. And it's really not that complicated a set of ideas. But it made me realize that sometimes the low-hanging fruit can be the most powerful. So like being quiet and asking the same question twice is really valuable, and also showing appreciation. And that's something I've brought into not just my coaching, but into facilitating and even my conversations with people. It grounds people, and it also helps them connect and feel like they're being seen and valued. And I think that sometimes that human element is not always there. So that's one book. I'm just trying to think about others. This is a moment where I'm like, I wish I was in front of my bookshelf so I can scan. I know which section I'd be looking at as well. This is a more rogue response because it's not a coaching book, but I think it is. Julia Cameron, who's the writer of The Artist's Way, which is a groundbreaking creativity do-it-yourself course. A lot of what she talks about and the exercises she sets in the book, the self-reflection, are incredibly coachy. And they really help me break down my limiting beliefs and stories that I was telling myself, and work through them in a way that I felt very held, but also challenged at the same time. Each chapter, which is each chapter of the course, takes on a different part of the journey of rediscovering your creative self. And it was definitely very therapy-esque as well, therapy coachy in that sense. But one thing I liked about her book is it's not about, oh, this is a principle. It was, hey, go and do this experiment. How are you finding it? What are you feeling like? Don't worry, you're human. Everyone goes through this kind of experience. And it really reminded me of how messy we are as human beings, and also how much reflection we can do and how many patterns there are within ourselves. So that one I'd say is my more rogue response.
Awesome. Why rogue? It sounds like quite a relevant thing.
It's not a coaching book.
But Time to Think, really, the first one wasn't.
That one is.
Yeah, well, it's been used as a coaching book. More Time to Think was more about coaching. It's really about creating thinking environments. And it didn't seem to me that she wrote the book for coaches. It was more that she wrote the book for organizations to create more thinking spaces.
Yeah. Maybe it's because a lot of the coaching modules around presence often appeal to Nancy Klein exercises.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Which is funny because so much of coaching is still, seen as somebody telling you how to do things. And it seems to me that the more experienced coaches get, the more they are willing and to interrupt with their own perspective and their own knowledge and their own suggestions, and they're more likely to put things on the table. It's always mind-blowing to me how something like Time to Think could be such a groundbreaking thing, because wouldn't people value spaces where people can think before the early 90s? It's just it's odd.
It is. Maybe with the idea of coaching, you don't really know what you're gonna find or expect, that empty space, and that maybe might be seen as a bit risky to let people explore and hope they come up with their own solutions. But actually, it's one of those things, when you try, the more you try it, the more you realize how valuable it is.
Yeah, and people are so used to being guided. And fair play. It's it can be really valuable to be guided, but people are not used to spending time in a space where they are the ones who creating all the rules. And I really like that, because it can be an uncomfortable space for somebody who's very used to being guided, and that's why I think the space is so radical. Yeah, thank you again. We could spend a lot of time in that space. If someone asks you what the difference is between therapy and coaching, what do you say?
Oh, I always ask this question. I say that coaching is future-oriented, and therapy is often going back to the past and solving wounds that came up from our patterns there. I think that I always say that in coaching we might go back into the past to some respect to discover if you have limiting beliefs and what the roots might be. But it's not a case of opening them up and trying to reduce the, say, trauma. It's more just recognizing that they're there. And in coaching, I would encourage people to work through their limiting patterns by changing their behavior and creating new cycles that reinforce that, and create new empowering beliefs, not necessarily working out where they came from and how your parents or caregivers or whatever got involved in that process.
Cool. Thank you. I always ask, there's always different answers, I don't think there can be a super clear answer that is the defining answer for all the times, but everybody has to kind of create their own boundaries around this. And I think that's why it's so important to get different perspectives on where those boundaries lie. And thank you for yours.
That makes me want to go and listen to all the recordings, conversations, to see what everyone else said.
Oh, excellent. Then I like that. I should have built that in strategically.
You could almost have a clip, which is every person you've ever interviewed tells you the answer to that question.
Oh no, I'm gonna put them in at random places nowadays, so that everybody has to listen to all the conversations
to find out that.
Unless somebody on YouTube puts a compilation up, and then all my strategic work is going to be destroyed. Cool, thank you. Are there any notable current or future trends in coaching that you can see? Anything that you've noticed in the world of coaching that seems remarkable, as in worthy making a remark about?
So one aspect is the fact that the coaching is unregulated. and the term itself is so widely used. I'm very interested to see what happens in this space, and to see if it's something which doesn't really help with this line of work, given as well that there are a lot of people becoming coaches, and also the world is moving towards a very multiple identity / freelancery thing. So I guess for me, it's just a question of like, how will this impact us going forward? Personally, I feel like there is such value in having people who help us think, and help us see the world differently in our blind spots. And one of the top 10 future skills, according to the World Economic Forum, is interpersonal skills, and being able to be very collaborative and work together as humans. So I see that there could be a really interesting trend too there in learning to read people and to work with people and to be really sensitive and emotionally on it. That could be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I agree. As artificial intelligence is going to replace more and more jobs, the jobs that will remain strongly human will the ones that require human skills that no computer can possibly learn truly. You might be able to mimic some of them, but like being aware of who we are, our sense of identity, and like how we come across, being able to be recognizing emotions and creating human experiences. Totally agree that will be very important. And everybody who's getting coached is also learning some of those skills. So I couldn't agree more. Tell me, without breaking confidentiality, obviously, but tell us about one of your most memorable clients.
Is there anything in particular that you would like to know about that relationship?
No. I mean, I am somewhat curious about just like clients that kind of stick out, clients that kind of threw you, maybe a client who's like achieved particularly well or went through a particular transformation. Maybe there was a particular moment in the coaching that kind of stuck out that was particularly challenging or maybe very rewarding.
Okay, so I've had a very long-term client. I've worked with essentially through everything. We've done health, habits, self-love, career change, relationships. It's been a really fruitful and rewarding collaboration together, relationship. And I love the, I guess, intensity with which we've worked together. It feels safe. At least I hear from them that it feels like that, where they can be themselves. And actually there were some really remarkable moments where they felt so safe to cry on our call. And I'd noticed that had not happened up to that point, but I felt like it probably could have. So we had a really good conversation about around shame. They felt shame, being very emotional, and because they worried or what I might think about it. And that then opened up the space to then talk about how we relate and that pattern that was showing up. And they went through a huge shift over a few months, actually. And then many of our calls involve tears now. And it's so nice how normal it is. It's also been a really rewarding relationship because they've been very open to exploring different modalities within coaching. So I've kind of experimented with a lot of different tools, and had some really positive effects, and got really good feedback as well around what works well or not. And it reminded me that different humans need different things at different times. Sometimes it needs to be in the body, sometimes it needs to be cognitive, sometimes it needs to be very creative. And I've really enjoyed that kind of part of our working relationship.
Hmm. Yeah, I see a lot of coaches, especially early on, but also some quite experienced coaches who learn a new technique or like a new intervention or a new approach to ask questions. And they're very hesitant to apply that unless it's like strictly a practice client who doesn't pay them and it's contracted that they're going to be trying out some new stuff. Where actually quite often we can bring in something that we're just learning about and just kind of contracting that in the moment. Here's something that might be quite helpful. How do you deal with that? Because it sounded like you were trying out a few new techniques with somebody you were already working with.
Yeah. So first of all, I realized that coaching is a creative act. And it is an improvisation. You're listening and trying to go a bit this way and then a bit this way and bringing in this and that. So it's not like when I bring in a new model that I'm completely, it's not really different to anything else. Maybe I'm less familiar with the model, but again, I'm still just being creative. And actually that's something I do quite well. So the way I get around it is I just say to my client, hey, I think I've got an exercise that would be useful here. Should we give it a go? Do you want to give it a go? So I get the contracting part, and they might ask me maybe more about the exercise, etc. But then also, I have the permission and the freedom just to go for it. And yeah, that seems to be enough, I think.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you. Again, we could continue this, but I have another question. Have you ever had to stop working with a client? Is there any time where you said, I can no longer work with you anymore, or I won't?
Yes. Yeah, I was conscious that one of my clients needed therapy much more than they needed coaching. And the kind of work we were doing was, I felt like they would get more value seeing a therapist. And I was also conscious that I didn't want to give them the support that they might need that I couldn't give them.
Do you remember how you referred them? Because that's the saying no bit, right? That we want to do particularly right when it comes to that kind of conversation.
So when you say referred, do you mean how I shared that with them?
Yeah. How can you say, I don't want to, or I'm no longer the right person to work with you? Because that's what we're saying. In a way, we're saying no to working with a client, either somebody we've already started working with, but like, how do you communicate that so that they feel supported rather than, abandoned?
Yeah. So towards maybe the end of a session, when we've had a chance to work through something, I might make some reflections about the session. And first of all, to maybe thank them for their courage and showing up and being vulnerable and sharing these really meaningful things that came up. So that's the acknowledgement value part. Then I would also say that I noticed that we were talking about a lot of things that went back to, say, their childhood, and that feel very raw and very highly emotional about. And I would then tell them, I'm a coach, and often I'm not trained in going back into the past and in trauma, and it is my desire that they are fully supported in that process, because it can be quite a difficult one, and that actually I think therapy might be a really useful, beneficial activity to do, because, and I talk about the different outcomes that you can get from therapy. And then say, I can make some suggestions about different kinds of therapy you might like. How does that sound to you?
I love it. Thank you. The reason I'm always asking these things is because it can be really difficult for a coach, especially when they're new, to abandon a client, depending what story you tell yourself, because it's really not abandoning. It's making sure that they're working with the right person. And the way that you communicate it is so important. And the way that you communicated it just now was beautiful, and I find that a lot of coaches look for the words. So it's great to see some of that in particular scenarios and putting it into context of what you might say here, what you might say there. It always sounds a little different, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool, thank you. So last but not least, and this is the kind of question I teased at the beginning just before we hit record. If you could take over the screen of any person or group for 30 seconds, maybe for a minute, what would be your message? To whom and why?
Oh, this is such a difficult question. Okay, let me give it a moment to think about it. Okay, I think I've got something. I'm not sure how content I am with what I've got, but
That's okay. I'm only giving you 2 minutes to make a decision, and then afterwards the opportunity will have vanished forever.
it will, and I might come up with a better solution in a few hours' time. So I think something along the lines of remember everybody is human. You know, at the end of the day, behind everyone's job, they have family and friends. They're challenged with something in their life that they're probably not talking to you about, with desires and opportunities for what they want to do with this limited time we have on Earth. And be kind, be curious, and I don't know, ask about people's stories or something like that. I don't know, I'd be more eloquent, hopefully, if I thought about it. But the essence of it is to remind people to see what's beyond.
Awesome. I love that. Everybody's human. Also makes for a great billboard. Shout out to Tim Ferriss, who I stole this question in some format from.
I was thinking actually if that was the same one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same question that is asked, right? What is worth communicating to the world? And I don't think a billboard is necessarily helpful, because like not everybody has like I've seen a few billboards recently, but it's certainly not something that would really grab my attention. But like, if you can just take over people's screens for a minute, because surely that'd be glued to it. Everybody's human is, I think, a really good reminder. Yeah. Great. Well, where can people find you? You mentioned a couple of like really interesting courses or opportunities, given that, you know, you literally teach people how to have conversations with strangers. I know there's some great materials that I'm going to put in the show notes around how can you strike up conversations in professional contexts, in social contexts. I know there's a flagship course you've developed around how to have better conversations. Where can people find you? What do you want to tell people about? Pitch away, and so make sure that people who love this conversation know where they can connect with you.
Cool. Yes, so I am actually in the final stages of getting together my flagship conversation course, which is going to be virtual this year. And it's on my website, triggerconversations.co.uk. You can sign up for interest there and also join the mailing list too. I'm also on Facebook, and people can connect with me personally, send me an email, georgie@triggerconversations.co.uk. I write a rather experimental newsletter.
Which is awesome, by the way. I recommend it.
Yannick is a fan of. Called Conversations with Georgie. And it was meant to be about conversations, and now it's about life, and it involves conversations as well. So yeah, I guess it's the home of my thoughts, and I send one every 4 weeks or so. So yeah, please do join onto that. I think that's most of there's lots of different ways to find me, but I'm also keen on people just email me and say hi. That's a fun way to connect too.
Yeah, what a powerful conversation starter. Hi.
Hi. Well, ideally, it may be something that they're curious about, or something they'd like to connect on, you know, but...
Yeah, I wonder how many hi emails can we generate towards Georgie? Let's keep her busy for a few weeks.
Exactly.
No, it's got to be there's one more thing that you're curious about based on this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Good answer, I agree.
Georgie, anything else you want to say?
Yes, I think I do. What do I want to say? Yeah, I wanted to reflect on one thing that I've been thinking about throughout the call, this conversation even, is the messiness of it. And I'm not saying it's because, Yannick, you did a really poor job of questions or navigating it, but more a reflection that things are messy. And that appears to, like, you know, any particular moment in time when you're, you know, having an interview, or whether you're doing a coaching call or having a conversation with somebody, it's making it up. Everyone's making it up on the spot. And rather than that being oh my God, we didn't get it right. I believe that that's a recognition that, oh, we're just being human and it's fun and we're iterating and we're experimenting. And actually that is one of the most joyful things about life, is to recognize the mess and be okay with the mess and find meaning throughout that. And I imagine that's something that probably comes up a lot in positive existentialism as well. But I really feel it a lot these days. And the more I reflect, have that principle in my life, the more I feel at ease.
I just love that, because how many times are you in a space and in the back of your mind you're thinking about how can I make this relevant or valuable, and like, yes, I have part of my mind that is thinking about coaching specifically, but that's already in me. I can't really take that out. Any conversation that we would have in 2 hours would definitely be coaching themed, because that's so much of what I do. So allowing ourselves that space allows us to be a lot more present. And then a lot of these nuggets, they come out of these little detours that we take. And I think I would encourage coaches who are not traditionally SMART goal, laser focus on the SMART goal. You know, if you're a coach who is committed to allowing a bit more space, then that magic can happen if you create the right environment for it. And the right environment for that kind of magic is not, let's get to the agreed outcome as quickly as humanly possible.
Yep, exactly. Well said.
Brilliant. Georgie, thank you for this conversation. I hope we have many more, and I'll let you go for now.
It's very kind of you. I look forward to future conversations in person and virtually.
Indeed. Georgie, thank you. Bye-bye.